August 6, 1942. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, casting its light across thousands of miles of contested water. On this particular Thursday morning, exactly 8 months had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The date itself was unremarkable in the grand sweep of the Pacific War. No major battle occurred on this day. No decisive engagement. No dramatic turning point captured in newspaper headlines. Yet for the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy, August 6, 1942 represented something far more significant than any single battle could convey. It marked the moment when the full weight of their strategic miscalculation became impossible to ignore. To understand what made this day so crucial, we need to step back and examine the context that led to this reckoning. The story begins not on August 6th, but 2 months earlier. It's the first week of June 1942, when the Japanese combined fleet suffered its most catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had been haunted by doubts from the very beginning. Before the war even started, Yamamoto had spent years in the United States, first as a student at Harvard University and later as naval attaché in Washington. Unlike many of his colleagues in the Japanese naval hierarchy, Yamamoto understood American industrial might firsthand. He had walked through American factories, observed American shipyards, and witnessed the sheer scale of American production capacity. What he saw terrified him. In 1940, when asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono about the prospects of war with the United States, Yamamoto gave a brutally honest assessment. He told Kono, "If we are ordered to fight, then I can guarantee to put up a tough fight for the first 6 months. But I have absolutely no confidence as to what would happen if it went on for 2 or 3 years." This was not false modesty or Japanese politeness. Yamamoto genuinely believed Japan could not win a prolonged war against America. Think about what Yamamoto was saying. He was not predicting victory. He was predicting 6 months of success, followed by inevitable defeat. His plan for Pearl Harbor was never about winning the war. It was about buying time, about delivering such a devastating blow to the American Pacific Fleet that the United States would seek a negotiated peace before its industrial machine could fully mobilize. Yamamoto wanted to destroy American morale, to make the cost of war seem so high that the American public would demand their government accept Japanese conquests in Asia and the Pacific. But Yamamoto made several critical miscalculations. And by August 6, 1942, those miscalculations had become undeniable. The first mistake was believing that the attack on Pearl Harbor would have the demoralizing effect he desired. Instead, it had precisely the opposite impact. The attack, coming without a declaration of war due to a delay in delivering Japan's diplomatic message, was perceived by Americans as a treacherous sneak attack. Rather than breaking American will, it unified the nation in a way nothing else could have. President Franklin Roosevelt called December 7, 1941, a date that would live in infamy, and he was right. The attack gave America a rallying cry. Remember Pearl Harbor. The second mistake was tactical. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, had ordered his aircraft to focus on the battleships moored at Battleship Row. They succeeded spectacularly in that mission. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk. But Nagumo made a fateful decision. After 2 waves of attacks, with American anti-aircraft defenses awakening and his aircraft taking losses, Nagumo chose not to launch a third strike. This decision meant that several critical targets were left untouched. The oil storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of fuel, were never hit. If those tanks had been destroyed, the American Pacific Fleet would have been crippled for months, possibly years, as fuel would have needed to be shipped from the mainland. The repair facilities, including the crucial dry docks, were largely ignored. These facilities would prove invaluable in bringing damaged ships back into service far more quickly than the Japanese anticipated. Most critically, the American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that day. The USS Enterprise, US Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea. These carriers would become the foundation of America's counterattack. Yamamoto reportedly criticized Nagumo for not launching the third wave. He understood that in war, half measures often lead to complete failure, but the damage was done. The Pearl Harbor attack, while spectacular, had not achieved its strategic objective. It had not broken American will, it had not destroyed the American carrier fleet, and it had not crippled America's ability to wage war in the Pacific. For the first 6 months of 1942, Yamamoto's prediction of Japanese success seemed to be coming true. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with shocking speed. The Philippines fell. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered after a campaign that humiliated the colonial power. The Dutch East Indies, with its vital oil resources, came under Japanese control. Burma fell, severing the land route to supply China. Malaya was conquered. Japanese forces pushed into New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, threatening Australia's connection to the United States. This period of conquest seemed to validate the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese newspapers proclaimed victory after victory. The public celebrated their military's prowess. Admiral Yamamoto and the combined fleet appeared vindicated. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming in the facade of Japanese invincibility. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 should have served as a warning. This carrier battle, fought entirely by aircraft without the opposing surface fleets ever sighting each other, was technically a tactical victory for Japan. The Americans lost the carrier USS Lexington, while Japan lost only the light carrier Shoho. But strategically, the battle was a draw at best, a defeat at worst. The Japanese were forced to call off their planned invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea, marking the first time since Pearl Harbor that a Japanese offensive had been stopped. More ominously, Japan lost a significant number of experienced pilots and aircrew at Coral Sea. These men represented years of training and combat experience. Unlike the United States, which had implemented a rotation system that allowed veteran pilots to train new aviators, Japan kept its best pilots in combat until they were killed or incapacitated. Every experienced pilot lost was a permanent loss to Japan's combat effectiveness. But the Japanese naval leadership did not fully grasp this problem yet, not in May 1942. Then came Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, represented Yamamoto's attempt to finish what Pearl Harbor had started. His plan was ambitious and complex, perhaps too complex. He would use a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north, then launch a massive assault on Midway Island, a tiny atoll roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto believed that the Americans would rush their carriers to defend Midway, walking into a trap where the overwhelming superiority of the Japanese combined fleet would destroy them. The plan involved nearly the entire Japanese Navy, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and most importantly, 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the cream of the Japanese carrier fleet, the same ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was so confident of victory that he brought the massive battleship Yamato, the largest Inao's battleship ever built, to serve as his flagship. The American forces would be crushed, Midway would fall, and perhaps even Hawaii could be threatened, forcing America to accept a negotiated peace. But Yamamoto's plan had a fatal flaw. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval code. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, under the leadership of Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been painstakingly decoding Japanese messages. They learned that Japan planned to attack a target designated as AF. To confirm that AF meant Midway, the Americans sent a false message in the clear, stating that Midway's fresh water system had broken down. When Japanese intelligence intercepted this message and reported that AF was low on fresh water, the Americans had their confirmation. Admiral Chester Nimttz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew not only where the Japanese would attack, but approximately when. This intelligence advantage cannot be overstated. Nimitz was able to position his 3 available carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. The Japanese had no idea the American carriers were already in position. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike against Midway Island. The attack damaged the island's facilities but did not knock out the airfield. American aircraft from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers but were largely ineffective, suffering heavy losses. Nagumo ordered his aircraft to rearm for a second strike on Midway. This meant that the torpedo bombers, which had been armed with torpedoes for anti-ship operations, needed to have their weapons changed to bombs for attacking land targets. Then came the report that Japanese scouts had spotted American ships, including what appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo was caught in a terrible dilemma. His aircraft were on the carrier decks being rearmed. The hangars below were crowded with fuel lines and ammunition. If he launched immediately, his aircraft would not be properly armed for an attack on enemy ships. If he waited to rearm, he would lose precious time and give the Americans the initiative. Nagumo chose to wait. It was a reasonable decision given the information he had, but it proved catastrophic. American torpedo bomber squadrons from the 3 carriers attacked the Japanese fleet. They were slaughtered. Out of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were shot down, most without scoring a single hit. The Japanese combat air patrol and anti-aircraft fire decimated them. It appeared to be another Japanese victory. But those torpedo attacks had served a crucial purpose, even if unintentionally. They had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude and pulled it out of position. When American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived at altitude minutes later, they found the Japanese carriers almost undefended. The Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft, were perfect targets. In the span of approximately 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were fatally hit. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were set ablaze. Massive fires fueled by aviation gasoline and exploding ammunition, turning them into infernos. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch a counterattack that crippled Yorktown, but American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and left her burning as well. By the end of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were sinking or abandoned. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead or would die in the coming hours. More than 200 of Japan's most experienced pilots were gone. The Battle of Midway was a disaster for Japan on every level. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was bad enough, each one representing years of construction and an irreplaceable asset. But the loss of trained pilots and maintenance crews was even worse. Japan had started the war with approximately 2,000 carrier-qualified pilots. These were men who had trained for years. Losing 200 of them in a single battle, along with the mechanics and ordnance specialists who kept the carriers operating, was a blow from which Japan would never recover. Yamamoto called off the invasion of Midway and ordered a retreat. For the man who had predicted 6 months of victories, the timing was prophetic. Midway occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His period of running wild was over. In the immediate aftermath of Midway, the Japanese naval leadership went into a state of shock and denial. The loss was so catastrophic, so unexpected, that many could not process what had happened. The Japanese government concealed the full extent of the defeat from the public. Newspapers reported a great victory. Survivors of the sunken carriers were quietly isolated to prevent them from spreading word of the disaster. Even within the Navy, many officers did not know the true scale of what had been lost. But the admirals knew, Yamamoto knew, and they understood that something fundamental had changed in the Pacific War. The question was whether they could acknowledge what it meant and adjust their strategy accordingly. This brings us back to August 6, 1942, and why this seemingly ordinary day was so significant. On August 7, 1942, one day after our focus date, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This was the first major American offensive operation of the war. The Marines seized a partially completed Japanese airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field. The Japanese had been building this airfield to threaten Allied supply routes to Australia. Now it was in American hands. But the planning for this operation, the intelligence gathering, the assembly of forces, all of this had been happening in the weeks before August 7th. And the Japanese naval intelligence was aware that something was brewing. They had detected unusual Allied ship movements in the South Pacific. They knew the Americans were preparing some kind of operation. But there was confusion and disagreement about what the Americans were planning and how to respond. On August 6, 1942, the Japanese naval leadership was still trying to come to terms with what Midway meant for their overall strategy. They were trying to assess their available forces, their losses, their remaining capabilities, and they were beginning to confront an uncomfortable truth. The war was not going according to plan. Let's examine what the Japanese situation actually was on August 6, 1942. After Midway, Japan had only two large fleet carriers operational, Shokaku and Zuikaku. Both had been damaged or depleted at the Battle of the Coral Sea and had not participated at Midway. There were also several light carriers and converted carriers, but the main striking power of the carrier fleet was gone. This meant Japan no longer had the ability to project overwhelming air power across the Pacific. They could no longer roam at will, as they had in the first months of the war. The loss of experienced pilots was equally critical. Japan's pilot training program was extremely rigorous, taking approximately 2 years to produce a fully qualified carrier pilot. There was no way to quickly replace the men lost at Coral Sea and Midway, and Japan's training infrastructure was not designed for the kind of rapid expansion that a long war would require. The Americans, by contrast, were already expanding their training programs dramatically, preparing to produce thousands of new pilots. Then there was the question of industrial production. This is where Yamamoto's pre-war warnings became horrifyingly relevant. The United States had begun an unprecedented military buildup. American shipyards were launching new vessels at a pace Japan could never match. Aircraft factories were churning out planes by the thousands. The numbers were staggering. In 1942 alone, the United States would produce approximately 48,000 aircraft. Japan, for the entire war from 1939 to 1945, would produce roughly 76,000 aircraft total. Think about that ratio. America was producing in a single year about 2/3 of what Japan would produce in 6 years of total war. And American production was still ramping up. By 1904, the United States would be building nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year. The disparity in shipbuilding was even more dramatic. After Midway, the United States had lost one carrier, the Yorktown. In the following months, multiple new carriers would begin joining the fleet. The Essex-class carriers, vastly superior to anything Japan had, were already under construction. By the end of 1943, the United States would have more carriers in service than it had lost in all of 1942. Japan, meanwhile, was struggling to replace even a fraction of what it had lost. Let's talk about some specific numbers that the Japanese admirals would have known or suspected by August 1942. The United States had authorized the construction of the Two-Ocean Navy under the 1940 Vinson-Walsh Act. This called for a massive expansion of the fleet, including multiple new battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and crucially, at least 11 new fleet carriers. These ships were already being built. Some were close to completion. The Japanese knew about this program, but the implications were only now becoming clear. Japan had limited shipyard capacity. Building a single fleet carrier took years. The Shinano, which would be converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull to a carrier, would not be completed until 1904, and it would be sunk by an American submarine just 10 days after commissioning. Japan simply did not have the industrial infrastructure to match American production. Oil was another critical factor. Japan had gone to war partly to secure access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. The captured oil fields were producing, but transporting that oil back to Japan required tankers, and those tankers were increasingly vulnerable to American submarines. Japan had started the war with about 6 million tons of oil reserves. By August 1942, those reserves were already being drawn down faster than they could be replaced. The Americans, by contrast, had essentially unlimited oil. The United States was the world's largest oil producer. There was never any question of fuel shortages for the American military. Every ship, every plane, every tank could be fueled without worry. This meant American forces could operate at a tempo that Japan could not sustain. On August 6, 1942, the Japanese admirals were confronting all of these realities simultaneously. They had just lost 4 irreplaceable carriers. They knew the Americans were planning offensive operations. They understood that time was working against them. Every month that passed made America stronger while Japan's position eroded. There's a human element to this that's important to understand. These were professional naval officers who had devoted their entire careers to the Imperial Navy. Many of them had studied at the Naval Academy in Itajima, had risen through the ranks over decades, had dedicated their lives to making Japan a great naval power, and now they were being forced to confront the possibility that their entire strategic framework was built on a foundation of sand. Admiral Yamamoto, more than anyone, must have felt the weight of this realization. He had opposed the war with America from the beginning. He had warned his political masters that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict. He had argued against the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. His reward for this wisdom had been death threats from ultranationalists and the need for bodyguards. When ordered to plan for war, he had done his duty, creating the Pearl Harbor attack plan. But he had never believed it would lead to victory, only to a temporary advantage that might, just might, convince America to negotiate. Now, 8 months into the war, Yamamoto could see that even his pessimistic predictions had been too optimistic. America had not sought negotiations. American morale had not broken, and the industrial might he had warned about was beginning to manifest in devastating fashion. The 6 months he had promised to run wild were over. The period where he had no confidence in victory had begun, and it would be worse than he had imagined. But Yamamoto was trapped by duty and honor. He could not publicly admit that the war was unwinnable. To do so would be seen as defeatist, perhaps treasonous. The Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on fighting spirit and willingness to die rather than surrender, did not allow for open discussion of strategic defeat. So, Yamamoto and his fellow admirals were forced to continue planning operations, continue fighting battles, continue pursuing a victory they knew was impossible. The Guadalcanal campaign, which would begin in earnest the day after our focus date, would demonstrate all of these problems in microcosm. The Japanese would fight with incredible tenacity and courage. Individual units would fight to the last man rather than surrender. But the overall strategic situation was hopeless. The Americans could bring more men, more supplies, more ships, more aircraft to the battle than Japan could sustain. Let me describe what the next 6 months after August 6th would look like for the Japanese Navy. It would be a grinding war of attrition around Guadalcanal, a series of brutal naval battles fought mostly at night in the waters near Savo Island. The Japanese would win several tactical victories, sinking American ships and inflicting heavy casualties, but they would be unable to dislodge the Marines from Henderson Field or cut off American supply lines. The Battle of Savo Island on August 9th saw the Japanese inflict a stunning defeat on the Allied fleet, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in a night action. But the victory was incomplete. The Japanese did not destroy the American transport ships and their supplies. Yamamoto would later criticize the commander, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, for this failure, just as he had criticized Nagumo for not launching a third wave at Pearl Harbor. Winning tactical victories while failing to achieve strategic objectives was becoming a pattern for the Japanese Navy. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August would see the Japanese lose another light carrier, while American industrial production continued to accelerate. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October would be a tactical Japanese victory, with the carrier USS Hornet sunk, but Japan lost more irreplaceable pilots. Every engagement followed this pattern. Japan might win the battle, but was losing the war. By November, the naval battle of Guadalcanal would see the Japanese make their last major attempt to retake the island. They would lose 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, stars, and 11 transport ships. The Americans would also suffer heavy losses, but the crucial difference was that America could replace what it lost. Japan could not. In December 1942, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters would make a fateful decision. They would evacuate Guadalcanal. Operation Key, as it was called, would successfully extract most of the surviving Japanese troops from the island in early February 1943. It was a skillfully executed operation, but it represented a fundamental shift in the war. For the first time, Japan was giving up territory it had captured. The defensive perimeter was contracting, not expanding. Let's return to that question. Why was August 6, 1942 so significant if no battle occurred on that day? Because it represents the moment between the disaster of Midway and the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign. It was the calm before the next storm, a brief pause where the Japanese naval leadership could assess their situation without the immediate pressure of combat. And what they saw, if they were honest with themselves, was grim. They had lost the initiative. They were about to be forced into a defensive campaign they were not prepared to fight. The American industrial machine was roaring to life. Every intelligence report, every assessment of American shipbuilding, Every calculation of replacement rates pointed to the same conclusion. Time was the enemy, and time was on America's side. Some historians have debated whether Midway or Guadalcanal was the true turning point of the Pacific War. The truth is that they were two parts of the same turning point, two battles that together marked the shift from Japanese offensive to American offensive. Midway crippled Japan's carrier striking power. Guadalcanal demonstrated that Japan could not sustain a long campaign of attrition. Together, they validated everything Yamamoto had warned about before the war. There's a tragic irony in Yamamoto's fate. He had been right about everything that mattered. He had correctly predicted that Japan could achieve early victories but would ultimately be overwhelmed by American power. He had understood the importance of logistics and industrial capacity when many of his colleagues focused only on battlefield courage and fighting spirit. He had tried to avoid the war and, when forced to fight it, had tried to win it quickly before American strength could be brought to bear. And he had failed, not through any fault of his own, but because the task was impossible. Yamamoto would continue to command the combined fleet until April 1943, when American codebreakers would intercept messages detailing his inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. In a carefully planned operation, called Operation Vengeance, American P-38 fighters would ambush his aircraft and shoot it down over Bougainville. Yamamoto would die in the jungle, still holding his samurai sword, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor killed by the nation he had awakened. But on August 6, 1942, Yamamoto was still alive, still in command, and still confronting the reality of what his war had become. The dream of a quick victory was dead. The hope that America might negotiate was revealed as fantasy. The harsh mathematics of industrial production and resource allocation had rendered their verdict, and that verdict was unforgiving. For the other Japanese admirals, the realization came more slowly. Some never fully accepted it, continuing to believe in ultimate victory until Japan's surrender in August 1945. Others understood but could not speak the truth openly. The culture of the Japanese military did not reward honesty about strategic failure. Junior officers who suggested retreat or conservation of forces were labeled defeatist. Senior officers who questioned the overall strategy risked their careers or worse. This created a tragic dynamic where everyone involved knew the war was unwinnable, but no one could say it. So, Japan fought on, expending lives and resources in campaigns that had no realistic chance of success. Guadalcanal would fall, the Solomon Islands would be lost, New Guinea would be contested and eventually abandoned. The Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, all would fall to American advances. Each loss brought American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. The strategic error of Pearl Harbor was not in the execution, which was brilliant, but in the fundamental premise. Japan had assumed that a devastating blow would demoralize America. This assumption was based on a misunderstanding of American culture and psychology. Americans, when attacked, do not typically seek peace. They seek revenge. Pearl Harbor did not make America want to avoid war. It made America want to win the war, whatever the cost. Japan had also assumed that America would not be willing to pay the price necessary to cross the Pacific and assault the Japanese home islands. This assumption proved equally wrong. American forces would fight their way across the Pacific, island by island, paying a terrible price in blood, but never wavering in their determination to achieve unconditional surrender. The attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted significant damage, but it had failed utterly in its strategic purpose. Instead of intimidating America into accepting Japanese expansion, it had united America in determination to destroy the Japanese military machine. Instead of buying time for Japan to consolidate its gains, it had triggered an American mobilization that would produce the largest and most powerful military force the world had ever seen. By August 6, 1942, the evidence of this failure was mounting. The Japanese admirals could see it in the intelligence reports. They could read it in the assessments of American production. They could calculate it in the math of carrier replacement rates and pilot training programs. The only question was whether they would acknowledge the implications of what they were seeing. Some did. Yamamoto certainly understood. Other senior officers began to grasp the reality, though they might not speak it aloud. But understanding a problem and being able to solve it are two different things. The Japanese admirals were locked into a war they could not win, fighting an enemy whose strength grew every day. defending an empire that was already beginning to contract. The next 3 years would see this reality play out in brutal detail. The carrier battles of 1942 would give way to the island-hopping campaigns of 1943 and 1904. The Solomon Islands would fall, then the Gilberts, then the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Each American advance would bring B-29 bombers closer to Japan. The Japanese Navy would be systematically destroyed in battles, like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Japanese cities would be burned by incendiary bombs. The merchant marine would be sent to the bottom by American submarines, cutting off the oil and resources that Japan needed to continue fighting. And through it all, the admirals who had planned and executed the Pearl Harbor attack would watch their predictions come true. They had awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with terrible resolve, just as the famous, though likely apocryphal quote attributed to Yamamoto suggested. They had achieved 6 months of victory, followed by years of defeat. They had gambled that a quick strike would win the war, and they had been catastrophically wrong. August 6, 1942 stands as a symbolic date in this narrative. It was the day when the full weight of these strategic errors could no longer be denied. The day when the calculations showed that Japan could not replace its losses, could not match American production, could not win the attritional struggle that the war had become. It was the day when the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy had to confront the truth that Pearl Harbor had not been their greatest triumph. It had been their greatest mistake. The human tragedy in all of this is profound. These were not evil men, though they served an aggressive and often brutal regime. They were professionals who loved their service and their country. They had trained for war, studied naval strategy, devoted their lives to maritime power, and now they were watching that life's work crumble, knowing that the war they were fighting was unwinnable, but being unable to stop it. Think about the psychological burden of that knowledge. Imagine being Admiral Yamamoto, knowing that every order you give, every plan you make, is ultimately futile. Knowing that the young pilots you send into combat are going to die in a lost cause. Knowing that the ships you dispatch to battle will be sunk by an enemy that can replace its losses 10 times over. And yet being bound by duty and honor to continue fighting, to maintain the facade that victory is possible, to inspire your subordinates to keep sacrificing themselves for a goal that cannot be achieved. This is the dark reality that August 6, 1942 represents. It's not a day of battle or a day of surrender. It's a day of recognition, of understanding, of facing a truth that had been building since December 7, 1941, but could no longer be avoided. The admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy knew, on that August day, that they had made a terrible mistake. They knew that Pearl Harbor had not intimidated America, had not crippled the Pacific Fleet beyond recovery, had not bought enough time to secure Japan's conquests. They knew that American industry was producing ships and planes faster than Japan could sink or shoot them down. They knew that every passing month made the strategic situation worse, and yet they could not stop. The machinery of war, once set in motion, is difficult to halt. Political realities, military culture, national pride, all of these factors made it impossible for Japan to simply admit defeat and seek peace in August 1942. So, the war would continue for 3 more years. Hundreds of thousands more would die. Japanese cities would be destroyed. 2 atomic bombs would be dropped. And finally, in August 1945, Japan would surrender, accepting the occupation and transformation that Yamamoto and his colleagues had gone to war to prevent. Looking back from our perspective, the entire arc of the Pacific War can be seen in the contrast between December 7, 1941 and August 6, 1942. In December, Japan struck what seemed like a devastating blow, catching America by surprise and sinking much of the battle fleet. It appeared to be a triumph of planning and execution, a validation of carrier warfare, a demonstration of Japanese military prowess. But by August, the true consequences of that attack were becoming clear. America had not been intimidated. Its industrial base had been mobilized. Its people were united in determination to win. And the naval war had shifted from one of Japanese advances to one of American counterattacks. The period of running wild was over. The period of doubt and defensive struggle had begun. The tragedy is that it did not have to be this way. If Japan had limited its aggression, if it had sought to negotiate its position in Asia through diplomacy rather than conquest, If it had listened to voices like Yamamoto, who understood that war with America was unwinnable, history might have been different. But those paths were not taken. Instead, Japan chose war, chose to strike Pearl Harbor, chose to believe that American will could be broken by a single blow. And on August 6, 1942, the Japanese admirals who had made those choices were confronting the consequences. They were looking at maps showing American forces landing at Guadalcanal. They were reading reports of American shipyard production. They were calculating replacement rates for carriers and pilots. And they were reaching an inescapable conclusion, even if they could not say it publicly. Pearl Harbor had been a fatal mistake. This is not to say that the Japanese Navy stopped fighting or that its admirals gave up. Far from it. They would continue to fight with skill and courage for 3 more years. They would win tactical victories and inflict significant casualties on American forces. Individual units would fight with a determination and willingness to sacrifice that commanded respect even from their enemies. But the strategic framework was broken. The war could not be won. Every battle, every campaign, every sacrifice was delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it. The subsequent naval battles around Guadalcanal would demonstrate this clearly. At the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese would sink 4 Allied cruisers in a brilliant night attack. But they would not destroy the transports, would not cut off American supplies, would not drive the Marines from Henderson Field. At the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November, the Japanese would lose battleships and transports in a desperate attempt to reinforce their garrison. The battles would be fierce and costly for both sides, but the outcome was never really in doubt. America could afford the losses. Japan could not. This pattern would repeat across the Pacific for the next 3 years. Japan would fight skillfully, would inflict casualties, would hold defensive positions with fanatical determination. But the mathematical reality of industrial production and resource allocation could not be overcome by courage or fighting spirit alone. For every American ship sunk, 2 more would be launched. For every American pilot killed, 3 more would complete training. The balance of power was shifting inexorably against Japan, and it had been set in motion by the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Some historians have argued that Japan had no choice, that American economic sanctions in response to Japanese aggression in China had left Japan with the choice between war and abandoning its imperial ambitions. There's some truth to this argument. The American oil embargo of July 1941 did present Japan with a serious crisis. Without oil imports, Japan's military machine would grind to a halt within months. From that perspective, the choice to go to war to secure oil from the Dutch East Indies had a certain logic. But this argument ignores the fact that Japan's position was itself the result of earlier choices. Choices to invade China, choices to align with Nazi Germany, choices to pursue an expansionist foreign policy that brought it into conflict with the United States and other Western powers. These were not inevitable choices. They were policy decisions made by Japanese political and military leaders. And those decisions created the crisis that led to Pearl Harbor. Moreover, even accepting the premise that war was necessary to secure oil, the specific choice to attack Pearl Harbor was not inevitable. Japan could have focused its offensive on the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya without attacking American territory. It's possible that the United States would have entered the war anyway, but it's also possible that the isolationist sentiment in America would have prevented immediate intervention. By attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan guaranteed American entry into the war and guaranteed that American entry would be accompanied by a level of national unity and determination that might otherwise have been lacking. So, the admirals looking at their situation on August 6, 1942 had to confront not just the immediate tactical problems of carrier losses and pilot attrition, but the larger strategic errors that had led to this point. They had misjudged America's will to fight. They had underestimated American industrial capacity. They had overestimated their own ability to achieve decisive results. And they had failed to secure a quick victory before American power could be mobilized. All of these errors could be traced back, directly or indirectly, to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. The final irony is that the military success of Pearl Harbor made these strategic errors worse. If the attack had failed, if American defenses had been more alert, if the carriers had been in port and been sunk, if Japanese losses had been heavy, then perhaps Japan's leadership would have reconsidered their strategy earlier. Perhaps diplomatic solutions would have been explored. Perhaps the war could have been ended before it consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. But the attack succeeded brilliantly at the tactical level. The battleships were sunk. American casualties were heavy. The shock was profound. This tactical success validated the decision to attack in the eyes of Japan's political leadership and much of the public. It made it politically impossible to admit that the attack had been a strategic error. And so Japan was committed to a course that Yamamoto and other knowledgeable officers knew was doomed to failure. August 6, 1942, was not the day that Japan lost the war. That outcome had been determined the moment American industrial mobilization began. It was not even the day that the admirals first realized they had made a mistake. Yamamoto, at least, had understood the risks both from the beginning. But it was a day when the accumulation of evidence, the reports from Midway, the intelligence about American preparations for offensive operations, the calculations of relative industrial strength, all came together to make the reality undeniable. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor to avoid a long war. The attack had guaranteed a long war. Japan had struck at the Pacific Fleet to demoralize America. The strike had unified and enraged America. Japan had sought to buy time to consolidate its empire. The attack had triggered a response that would destroy that empire completely. Every goal had been inverted. Every hope had been disappointed. And the admirals who understood naval warfare, who could read the intelligence reports and calculate the odds, knew that there was no path to victory from this position. They would fight on anyway, because that's what duty demanded. They would plan operations and dispatch forces and try to make the best of a terrible situation. Some would die in battle. Others would survive to witness the surrender in Tokyo Bay in September 1945. But from August 6, 1942 onward, they were fighting a war they knew they could not win, a war that the Pearl Harbor attack had made inevitable and unwinnable at the same time. This is the significance of August 6, 1942, not as a day of battle, but as a day of recognition. The day when the Imperial Japanese Navy's admirals confronted the full weight of their strategic error and understood that Pearl Harbor, far from being their triumph, had been their doom.